You're good. Okay. Right, comrades. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's meeting. We're very honoured to have Comrade Maya John speaking on the peasant struggle in India. It's very, very good to see so many comrades here that um, we, some of whom we haven't seen before, comrades from all over India, and it's a real pleasure. I hope you will sign up to come to future meetings of ours. We meet every week to discuss issues that are relevant to working class and popular struggles throughout the world. And I welcome you very much. And today, as I say, we have Comrade Maya John speaking. If I could just give a very brief introduction, I'd like to just to say that this struggle of the farmers in India is hardly known outside of India, and perhaps even less well known is the struggle also and the huge demonstrations and strikes have been of the working class in India. India is a seething cauldron at the present time. Of course, in terms of the its world status, it's now in terms of GDP, it's now number five in the kind of world league tables. But in addition to that, we have to say that there's very little understood about the huge class tensions and contradictions politically within India, because we've had massive movements, and almost unprecedented is the one that we're focusing on today, which has been lasting really for the last 5 years. Because as Maya will tell us, of course, in detail, I'm just going to give you a little overview that in 2020 and 2021, especially, hundreds of thousands of Indian farmers staged a prolonged siege of the capital city, New Delhi, in protest against three farm acts passed by Parliament in the September of 2020. These would have forced farmers to sell their produce to private capitalist monopoly corporations at prices dictated by the buyers. And the farmers, quite understandably, were demanding the creation of a legally enforceable minimum support price. And the bulk of the protesters came from the area in the environment of or the surroundings of Delhi, from Punjab and Haryana, which provide India with up to 90% of its wheat and up to 40 odd percent of its rice. And starting in February 2020, they besieged the capital city, camping on its outskirts, blocking the highways, building makeshift homes there. They defied police water cannons, lathis, that's truncheons or batons, tear gas, injunctions from the Supreme Court, and of course dirty propaganda from the government, which smeared the protest as a foreign conspiracy and a separatist Sikh activity. Now, it needs to be emphasized that the farmers' uprisings had nothing in common with the sort of raids on landed estates that were commended by the Naxalites or the Maoists in the past. This was not a guerrilla skirmish, but it was a mass movement in which the small farmers and the landless were converging on the capital in a rebellion more reminiscent, I can think of no other comparisons, of the peasant revolt in Britain in the 14th century, when the farmers invaded and surrounded and encircled and besieged London at that time. A rural uprising that dovetailed, in this case, with a massive urban strike movement. And in November 2020, a general strike was called in their support, one by the way of a series of general strikes in which a colossal and breathtaking number took part. 25 crore. That is 250 million workers, the length and breadth of India, participated, by making it by far the biggest strike, or along with the other general strikes of the period in India, in world history. And it took a year of deadlock before the government was forced to capitulate and repeal hated farm laws. Now, I won't say any more. Obviously, Maya will give us a much richer and more detailed understanding of the entire phenomenon. But it's a really absolutely breathtaking struggle in world history, and so I very much welcome Maya. Please, the floor is open to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Roger, for laying the ground for today's discussion. And a warm thanks again to Workers International Network for giving me this opportunity to, be part of this discussion on the peasant movement in recent times in India. I just wanted to check that I hope I'm loud enough and my voice is coming through clearly. I can then formally begin. Is it good?
Yes, sure.
Okay, great. So I, would just like to quickly, detail a few things about the farmers' movement that erupted in 2020, 2021. And then again, after it ebbed, it resurfaced in 2024. Just a few points. I don't want to go into too many details because this is information that a lot of activists, even here right now watching online would be aware of. And it's information that's out there and easily can be collated. What I'd just like to, emphasize is that yes, this movement has been seen as a ray of hope. It brought with it a lot of potential. But of course, our task as, revolutionary forces is to, closely analyze this large movement and its possibilities, the directions that, it did take and could take. Every passing week since, November, broadly speaking, 26th November 2020, we saw the farmers' movement firmly push forward with its agitation, and it was very innovative also in evolving methods to meet state repression and to lay siege to the capital city Delhi's borders very effectively. Now, there have been landmark moments of mass mobilization and various solidarity action programs, not just specific to Delhi, the capital city's borders, but across several parts of the country, in the first cycle of the farmers' movement in 2020, 2021, and then again in 2024. We know that there was a series of failed talks with the central government, which was led by the Bharatiya Janata Party government in the center. And of course, it's this dispensation, this ruling dispensation led by the Bharatiya Janata Party, which, pushed through the contentious, controversial farm laws, three of them, in the previous months in 2020 during the monsoon session of the parliament in 2020. Now, there seems to be some disruption. Should I stop? Am I audible?
Sorry, there's don't worry, carry on, please.
Now this
joining the meeting and they're not muted, so if you just bear with me, I am muting them as soon as I can. Sorry, carry on, Mike.
So with the pushing through of these three contentious farm laws in September 2020, we soon see in the subsequent months precipitated action by discontented farmers, which ebbed as came down with the official repeal of the three farm laws later in 2021. But of course, because of many unresolved issues and the fact that even though these laws have been repealed in indirect ways, their threat continues to unfold in the policy framework, in the policy ecosystem. Presently, we see, the second phase, the second cycle of the farmers' movement erupt in February 2024, which lasted up to early 2025. Now, as I said earlier, I'm not going into a lot of the descriptive details. My focus will be on providing an analysis of the peasant movement that erupted in these recent years by drawing our attention to the class composition of the movement and, broadly speaking, the nature of some of its key demands. In doing so, I hope to show that when analyzed closely, a mass movement like this, doesn't just then appear as, representative of a conflict with the state, but also is seen as a movement, something that, Roger also, mentioned in his introduction, tensions. It also embodied tensions and splits within the rural population that had been mobilized. The specific demands of the small peasantry and of landless agricultural labor have been relegated to the last, demands in the charter of demands of the farmers movement. And even, when we do see them rarely enlisted, they've never been the priority demands. They have been the least negotiated demands in the meetings between the farmers' organizations and the government. This makes it, therefore, further imperative that an autonomous movement of the poor peasantry, marginal peasantry in India, and agricultural landless labor is recognized as the need of the hour, as the need of the time. Highlighting this aspect, therefore, for me as an activist, is very important, and I'm bringing it to this discussion as it enables, highlighting this point enables the revolutionary left to introspect on how to mobilize the sea of poor and marginal peasants in many parts of the world, like in India. Moving on, the farmers' movement can be seen resisting. Of course, there's a very strong resistance to the state and to corporate, big capital, which we saw in the form of, resisting the three controversial laws that had been announced, their agenda to establish what are known as free trading zones. These laws would have, institutionalized free trading zones that would run parallel to the produce markets, which are also known as the mandis, managed by, what is the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee, government-backed, produce markets. And, if this institutionalization had gone through the, successful implementation of the three farm laws, it would have, of course, precipitated very quickly big corporate houses to monopolize trade in agricultural produce and to, and to further intensify a process that had already begun in the early 2000s, which is further weaken the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee, produce markets, so the mandi system. And this is a weakening, dismantling that, had already started in the late 90s, early 2000s. Now, the opposition of farmers has been also directed against the push towards the generalization of contract farming practices and the removal of the ceiling on storage of essential commodities that would allow corporates to hoard and dictate prices of agricultural commodities at will. Another demand of agitating farmers has been the legal constitution of minimum support price, MSP, for their crops. Having flagged the crucial demands that have been the forefront of the farmers' movement, what I'd like to move on to is, the fact that it's evident that we, of course, are witnessing a historical moment of pitched resistance against, pro-big capital measures of the Indian state. However, what I also want us to, recognize is that from this historical conjuncture, we can actually discern the conflation of contradictory interests of different rural segments. Now, both these realities, the contestation with the state that's pushing corporate interests and this, conflation of contradictory interests of different, segments of the rural population, beg the question as to the appropriate interpretation of the different currents, the different possibilities within the farmers' movement, and the requisite strategy for consolidating the influence of the revolutionary left on the resolutions sought by the mobilized, struggling peasant masses. Prevailing conditions of the agrarian sector in India, of course, we know it points to an undeniable fact, namely that, an agrarian transition has not panned out in a manner in which the early revolutionaries of the international working class movement had envisaged that it would. So rather than culminating in two great class formations pitched against each other, the agrarian bourgeoisie against the class of landless agricultural labor, a development which, presumes eventual apocalyptic destruction of the peasantry altogether, what we've actually seen in historical terms is modern day agriculture in both advanced capitalist and so-called backward capitalist zones has been, seen to support capitalist industrial sector, keeping very much intact the category of the peasant. Now, as a category of the peasantry has persisted within the current capitalist system and carries within it marked gradations or marked class, stratification, that's important point for us to engage with. So that means, in real terms, that small, poor, and marginal peasants in India are a very significant corpus of the rural population. We have statistics that show that they comprise 86% of those with land holdings in rural India. A significant proportion of these small, poor, marginal peasants are from what we identify as the middling and lower caste groups. They can identify it very easily on the basis of the size of their land holdings, which are very small, their crippling indebtedness, and the specificities of specificities of labor extraction for agricultural production. Typically, small and marginal peasants own less than 1 hectare of land. This is just to put out like a figure for you to keep in mind. And their agricultural output is also a product of extraction and heavy exploitation of family labor. So this means that, these peasant producers are not hiring paid agrarian agricultural workers on their fields. It's their own family labor that they are, using and exploiting. There's a lot of self-exploitation. Apart from this precariously placed segment of poor marginal peasants who are literally one harvest, one bad harvest, one accident, one medical emergency away from complete ruination. In India, we also see a very large section of landless agrarian labor, which is, because of its landlessness, compelled to labor on the fields of big and middling farmers. Typically, they comprise of, significant proportions of what are known as the quote-unquote untouchable castes in India, or in constitutional language, the scheduled castes mentioned in the Constitution's schedule. One of the distinguishing features of rich farmers, the other class, formation within the rural population, is their extraction, rich farmers' extraction of labor from landless agricultural workers. The primary contradiction in India's rural countryside is, in fact, that which plays itself out between the sea of exploited agricultural landless laborers and the expropriating class of their labor, the rich farmer. Now, this brute reality is concretely linked to the vast land-holding rights of rich farmers. By this virtue itself, rich farmers are also positioned in a distinct relationship of contradiction, antagonism, vis-a-vis, small marginal peasants. This contradiction of interests stems from the very dependent position of small marginal peasants on rich farmers. By this dependency, I'm referring to the dependency of small and marginal peasants on rich farmers being linked to, what we can identify as a scissors crisis in Indian agriculture, the brunt of which is borne by the poor peasantry. The scissors crisis implies that the input prices are higher than the price fetched by the output or the produce when it's sold. So small and marginal peasants, strive to negotiate this widespread phenomena and augment their meager incomes by heightened self-exploitation, both in terms of farm and non-farm activities. In sharp contrast, drawing on the surplus value of landless agricultural laborers and appropriating the produce of small peasants at distressed prices, much lower than that offered in the produce market, we find rich farmers actually being able to enhance their incomes, not through self-exploitation, but by over-exploiting someone else's labor. Now, the existing capitalist markets for agricultural agricultural inputs, in particular, nurture perennial high costs of farm implements, seed, fertilizer, insecticide, etc. And confronted by, these kind of very costly agricultural inputs, small and, marginal peasants are naturally pushed into a very disadvantageous position when it comes to the prices for their own agrarian produce, a disadvantage that is often facilitated by their inability to transport their produce to the nearest produce market, to the nearest mandi, without the assistance of rich farmers. Needless to say, small peasantry is forced to hire on rent transport facilities like tractors, trolleys, etc. from rich farmers. Their disadvantaged position further manifests itself in their subordination to a chain of middlemen between them and the nearest mandi or produce market, to augment, therefore, their low returns on their otherwise very limited agrarian produce from their inherited small land holdings. Poor marginal peasants are pushed, therefore, into leasing cultivable land from rich farmers at very high rents. Therefore, we have many reports that show that the small peasantry in India avails roughly of just about 40% of its income from cultivation, and it's piecing together a larger proportion of its income from non-farm activities. I'm drawing your attention to the details of each class, position within the rural population, also because it helps us make sense of the splits and, the tensions within the farmers' movement as it's unfolding before our eyes. It helps us make sense of the, the kind of problems that emerge with interlocking of markets for land, credit, and input technology for certain classes within the rural population. So the interlocking of these markets ensures that, small and marginal peasants are actually continuously ensnared by chronic indebtedness, high rentals for land that they're leasing from rich farmers, lack of resources to transport their produce to the nearest, mandis or produce markets, etc. And in most cases, these poor peasants are compelled to sell their produce at distressed prices to big farmers, traders, who are often combined in a single person. Overall, therefore, the unequal access to costly inputs and the superior bargaining power of rich farmers in these interlocked markets are the axes along which there are very tangible distinctions that we can draw and we need to draw between poor peasants and rich farmers. Considering the low level of profitability of cultivation for small peasants who are compelled to accept lower prices for their produce, the need to pay high rentals for various kinds of inputs, and the burden of loans that they've taken from rich farmers, middlemen, small and marginal peasants exercise a discernible interest in enhancing their precious incomes by availing what we can identify as a fair price for their agrarian produce. Now, for this section of the peasantry, this class of within the peasantry, a fair price means and it is articulated itself, of course, in the demand for a minimum support price. But here the fair price for the poor marginal peasant is the embodiment of their labor in the agrarian produce. So importantly, the identifiable interests of the poor peasantry in a fair price for their crops cannot be seen as the same as the demand for minimum support price that the rich farmer lobby is raising, and this is a point I'll flesh out in 3 or 4 minutes. In real terms, it is the big farmers, traders who are the real beneficiaries of the minimum support price, which is granted, as Roger also fleshed out in the introduction, on certain crops in India, 23 crops to be specific, of which wheat and rice are the major 2 crops. Notably, though the government declares minimum support prices for 23 crops, it's purchasing mostly wheat and rice at the minimum support price through its agencies. Consequently, the majority of agriculturalists in India, particularly the large mass of small and marginal peasants who cultivate crops other than wheat and rice, are unable to, until this day, are not availing of minimum support price for their produce, even if it is being declared officially by the government, because the government is not procuring many of those crops. Neither can we overlook the specific gender dimension to agricultural activities and the agrarian distress that we are seeing. Women are a very important component of family labor of small and marginal peasantry. In the context of growing rural impoverishment, women agriculturalists have been seen to stay back in the village and pursue agriculture, while male members of the families are moving to cities for wage work, and most of this is wage work in the informal in the informal industries. The denial, therefore, of minimum support price, what I call the fair price, weakening of the local agrarian markets, or mandis as they're known, and the overall bid of corporates to take over agricultural land through generalization of contract farming practices will essentially spell ruination for scores of women dependent on agriculture. So the three controversial farm laws, if they formally see the light of day in the way that the central government had first envisaged, will additionally hit the urban poor as well, of whom women are again a very large component. And this is because huge corporates will monopolize food production using several provisions in the controversial farm laws. Now, at this given juncture, how do we, see things move forward from here is a crucial question. Can we envisage, future trajectories unfolding only in the direction of two great class formations within agriculture? Do our strategies require revisiting in order to facilitate the weaning away of small and marginal peasantry's concerns and demands from their temporary conflation, their temporary convergence with the concerns of rich farmers? Importantly, the question of erosion of the peasantry and of historical contingencies, necessitates an assessment which steers clear of any kind of deterministic historical materialist reading of the repercussions of capitalist agriculture's development and consolidation and the nature of politics thrown up by the peasantry. And in this regard, I just quickly want us to, consider the kind of very interesting communications between Marx and the Russian socialist Vera Zajulich, who was one of the co-founders, along with Lenin, of the revolutionary paper Iskra. And this communication between Marx and Zajulich is on the possibilities of distinct paths of socialism in different parts of the world when compared to the trajectory of capitalist development in Western Europe. Now, notably, Zajulich sought a clarification from Marx on this question, given the need for revolutionary socialist forces to build a strategy distinct from that of the Russian populists, the Narodniki, and one which was grounded in the unfolding historical realities of the Russian commune, known as the Mir, which harbored certain potential for collectivist production along socialist lines. Essentially, Zajulich's concerns boil down to whether the revolutionary socialists should intervene and give shape to the peasant movement through necessary struggles to modernize the commune and free it of its conservative traditionalist forces, or whether the revolutionary socialist was to preoccupy herself with the urban working class under the calculation of the peasantry's destruction was fate accompli. Now, Marx had a very interesting response to Zajulich's queries. He didn't respond immediately. It took several months to study the Russian commune. And he highlighted in his communication that there were varied possibilities or resolutions to the crisis confronting small petty commodity producing peasants within the expanding dominant world of a capitalist economy. An argument he felt that his work Capital nowhere discounted. Marx distinguished the Western European historical trajectory of the expropriation of the agrarian producer and the possibilities of, and I'm using Marx's term, social regeneration that the Russian commune harbored if, and I quote him again, assured the normal conditions for spontaneous development, quote closed. So the persistence of the peasantry in India is similar, and its tussle with big capital is clearly an issue which warrants closer scrutiny of, through an analytical and political lens, which, in line with Marx, respects varied historical contingencies that accompany capitalist development in agriculture. The Indian peasantry is unlikely to be effaced from the social fabric of India anytime soon, and the need of the hour is the revolutionary class politics that seeks to consolidate a formidable alliance between the poor peasantry and the working class within the driven crisis precipitated by the three farm laws that we recently saw. Such intervention is precisely the axis around which the current mass of small and marginal peasants can be weaned away from the hegemonic control of the rich farmers' lobby, which is committed to furthering, consolidating its own bargaining position vis-a-vis agro-businesses and the Indian state that procures grain to support whatever vestiges or remnants we have of the public distribution system in India, the PDS. Now, while the farmers' movement is locking horns with the state capitalist combined, We undoubtedly, therefore, need to seriously articulate demands that fracture the prevailing momentary, fleeting conflation of interests between the ranks of poor peasantry and the ranks of rich farmers around certain immediate demands of minimum support price, or what I call the fair price, and other crucial demands. Now, true, there is an undeniable threat of corporates and big companies establishing their sway over the agricultural sector. However, the conditions of the majority segment of rural society in India, we must remember, poor peasants, agricultural labor, prior to this moment of the 3 farm laws being introduced, have been far from salutary. So we really need to look back at what we are dealing with and whose demands are we putting in the center. To comprehend this point further, let us turn more closely to the issue of minimum support price. Now, as explained earlier, the small peasantry has rarely availed minimum support price in the past. Because remember, the state is procuring only 2 major crops, wheat and rice at minimum support prices. The other crops for which it's declared minimum support prices, it's hardly procuring. And therefore, while raising the demand for MSP, minimum support price, in today's context, it is asserting a fair price. The poor peasantry, when it's asking for minimum support price, is basically asserting a fair price for its labor embodied in the produce. Rich farmers, in contrast, have thrown in their lot with this demand for the legal constitution of MSP for very different reasons. Rich farmers want to use the conduit of state-announced, legally binding minimum support prices, basically using it as a crucial floor price, to gain access to higher prices for the same crops in the open market. That means outside, the state-managed mandis, and therefore to earn more profits. At the same time, through minimum support prices, the rich farmer lobby also aims to wrest a minimum assured price in times of failure or crashing of the open market prices. In other words, rich farmers want the government to play the role of insurer by ensuring through legally constituted minimum support prices that the government would procure grains in the eventuality of the collapse of market.
Comrade Meyer, I'm sorry to cut you short.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to cut you off, just to tell you that you've had about 25 minutes so far.
Yeah, I'm just
Please
wrapping up.
carry on, because this is really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few more points. Moreover, let me say that rich farmers' demand for the minimum support price, remember, they're not pushing for compulsory procurement of a lot of the grains. They're just pushing for a legally recognized, and constituted minimum support price. So for rich farmers, the demand for MSP is, so as to ascertain the price which they will be able to also offer to small and marginal peasants who are often compelled to sell their produce to rich farmers at distressed prices. And in this way, the difference in the price at which MSP, minimum support price, is fixed, and the price at which rich farmers buy crops of poor marginal peasants is ascertained and concretized to the advantage, of course, of rich farmers. Over the period of time, earning substantially in this manner, I would say, it's a historical reality. We've seen it unfold in India. Rich farmers have been able to tide over the tendency for the rate of return in agriculture to be low in comparison to the cost of inputs. And in fact, we've seen from the ranks of rich farmers in India, the propensity to diversify into contractorship, liquor trade, numerous small capitalist ventures like setting up sugar mills, rubber factories, transport business, etc. And, we even have instances of regional bourgeoisie within India emerging from the ranks of, rich farmers. And in fact, even becoming from regional bourgeoisie transitioning into big capitalists. Meanwhile, in the opposing tendency, the ranks of small and marginal peasantry remains tied to petty commodity production. They're not diversifying in that way. And, given the general tendency of urban employment, where we're seeing, 3 workers work being extracted typically from 2 workers, thereby allowing for rampant overexploitation, what we see is very fleeting, if not little incentive for small peasantry in distress to exit small commodity production and join precarious informal work in the urban economy. In this light, it is necessary to push existing demands towards more radical solutions, which means recognizing certain possibilities thrown up by the peasant movement itself. Well, there are a lot of things that are there, in the peasant movement in a nascent form. From the concrete contradiction between the poor peasantry and rich farmers emerges then the revolutionary possibilities along the lines of pushing through, generalizing the demand for direct government procurement of produce of the peasantry. Now, such a measure will actually eliminate all middlemen between farm and plate, that means between producers and consumers. Not only would the possibility of ensuring minimum support prices to all the small and marginal peasants concretize, but would also ensure that cheap food grain and other consumables to the larger laboring population of the country is available through the public distribution system, the PDS. At present, the PDS in India is in a dismal situation. It's in ruins, with only a few items dispersed to the poor, and that too in inadequate quantities. In such conditions, compulsory public procurement of all produce of peasants would ensure that the laboring poor of this country receives a varied and complete diet for its consumption needs. In this way, MSP, along with, not just MSP, it has to be MSP, minimum support prices, along with compulsory government procurement, will ensure a fair price for the produce of small and marginal peasants who are otherwise, in selling their crops, their produce, at distressed prices to rich farmers. So it's a way of protecting that class of peasantry, consequently fortifying the genuine struggles of the vulnerable sections of the peasantry for productive compensation of their embodied labor. Likewise, minimum support prices accompanied by compulsory government procurement will also strengthen the parallel struggle of laboring poor who consume and are dependent on cheaply available subsidized agricultural produce through the government's public distribution system. Consequently, the demand and struggle for an expanded, rejuvenated public distribution system and the demand and struggle for fair price will converge in concrete economic terms, giving wider scope for alliance between the urban laboring poor and the small marginal peasantry. I conclude, therefore, comrades, with reasserting that clearly, on the one hand, we find that in historical terms, there hasn't been a complete destruction of the peasantry with the emergence of capitalist agriculture. On the other hand, we are witness to an agrarian romanticism of sorts, which surfaces in terms of, uncritically projecting and celebrating a unified struggle of the rural masses against a pro-corporate, pro-big capital state. Romanticism that actually blurs out the convergence, the conflation of demands arising from what are actually very antagonistically placed classes within the rural population. We need to see the seeds of transition that lie embedded in the current circumstances. The current scenario where we see certain trends that will be assimilated within the logic of the system, whereas there are other trends that can translate into intermediate demands, leading to possible transition beyond capitalism. So we need to identify where those seeds are. In this regard, we must engage with how the distinct demands of the exploited sections of the peasantry, the exploited classes within the peasant masses, that's agrarian labor and poor peasantry, are unfolding, and how do we strengthen and center those demands in the movement. Thank you so much.
Oh, fantastic, Maya. Thank you so much. That really gave us an insight. Particularly, we have comrades from a number of countries here, many of which really don't have a peasantry anymore, or only not on anything like the scale in India. And it's really interesting to see how the struggles of the poor peasantry, and it was very interesting how Maya made that distinction of the way that the rich farmers were exploiting the genuine mass struggle of the poorer farmers and the landless labourers. We have a lot to learn from you, and let's always remember this is part of a worldwide turbulence. I would like to say one point. There are many comrades here that we haven't seen before. Please come regularly. Every week we have meetings like this where we discuss struggles of the working class the world over and what we can learn from them. And you're all very, very welcome. If you could give your email address, either send it in the chat, or perhaps if you know Maya or other comrades here, ask Maya to pass it on to us. You'd be very, very welcome, and we want your input. So we particularly, of course, welcome any contributions of comrades here now. Please feel free to come in. with contributions, with questions, big or small. Don't feel any inhibitions. At the moment, there's one hand up. Ian, do you want to come in now?
Hi, thanks. Just a couple of quick questions. I say quick, but they might be on the big rather than the small side in terms of the answer. But just first of all, I was thinking in terms of this week in India, how the events with Pakistan and Kashmir and the war fever Modi's trying to build up could affect the peasant movement, which was massive and inspiring a few years ago and clearly still ongoing. But they're trying to make it on October the 7th. Will that cut across everything, or will this help cut across that? And the other one was the relationship with other agricultural movements around the world, especially with the class distinctions that you were drawing and that were very illuminating. How we relate to this idea of generalized agricultural movement that some people are promoting and other people are saying is a far right idea. In Sri Lanka, it toppled the government, largely agricultural protests. In Britain, it's become very controversial on the left whether to side with it or to side with almost the government in opposition to it. But obviously, in a totally different political economy where we don't have a peasantry. So, just what you think of this idea of a generalized agricultural revolt against neoliberalism? How you see India as part of that, or as totally separate things here and there? Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Who's next? Asit. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, okay.
Comrade Asit from Kanpur.
Yes.
You're still muted, Asit.
Yes.
Okay.
Good evening.
Hi,
Good evening,
comrade.
everyone. So I have two questions. One question that is the UPA government that is led by the Congress. They produced it organized the Swaminathan Commission reports for the peasants and landless farmer. So in present time, that is the non any party they supporting to this Swaminathan report, because the Swaminathan reports have the more than supporting to the landless farmers and the weaker section of the farmers. But in present time, Swaminathan report not implemented by the government, central government, including the Congress government and the other present government. So I think what is this have a problem in the present time in India, and also Comrade Maya John not the discussed on this point. Why did not supporting to the Swaminathan report? And next, second question is that mandi of the crops, the crops purchasing by the government through the mandi on MSP rates, but in free market, purchasing by the higher corporate industries, to purchasing the crops from the farmers. So nearest the farmers did not sell to the through the mandi our crops. So I want to know, Comrade Maya John, say what happened in this time. The more than corporate industries and big industrialists to purchase the like Adani and Amani to build the maximums go downs and the storage in India before the passed by the agriculture law by the central government. So I want to know the opposition parties not supporting to the Swaminathan report, and free markets, how to support to the farmers in present time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Asit. Any more? Well, who's next? By the way, Ian, I don't know if you saw the message from Maya. If you could send her your questions again in the chat. Okay.
Yes,
Right.
actually, Comrade, my internet seems to have been, kind of fluctuated. So it's broken up the voice. So if I can get a backup in terms of the questions in the chat box, it helps. But whatever I have been able to hear, I'm just responding. Of course, if I've left out something, I'll look at the chat box and respond further.
Did you say
What I
Ian or did you say the other comrade's name? I missed.
Ian, your second and third question was breaking a lot because of my internet connection.
Okay.
So what I'll do is if you can put it out in the chat box, second and third question helps. Meanwhile, I'll respond to your first question and then I'll move on to my, in response to Asit.
Okay.
So in terms of your initial question, Ian, about what are we expecting in terms of the heightened communal communalized ambience in recent days. What will it do to the farmers' movement? Well, the reality is, communal flashes, intensified communal, conflicts have been scattered across, India's political, social landscape. And while they have, seen precipitated, moments of such kind of conflict, we've also seen that when people in India are in a mode of struggle. So, for example, in the case of the agrarian sector, where a large number of peasant masses in various states are mobilized in northern India, and in certain other states in India, then the tendency or the propensity of them to be engulfed by communal strife is much lower. So people in struggle on their genuine issues, is really something that it prevents that kind of intensified communal flare up that may appear as a possibility given what's happening under this current regime. I would say that the farmers movement, the way we saw it in 2020, 2021, again in 2024, it actually, unified Hindu and Muslim peasantry. Especially I'm talking about in the context of Western UP, Western Uttar Pradesh. So we can't, immediately jump to conclusions that, this regime in the center and its various state governments in various states is going to easily be able to fracture, the peasant movement using the communal card. I'll wait for your second and third question. Asit, let me say that, in terms of my, the way I planned today's discussion was that I did not want to, go into a detailed engagement with the Swaminathan, report, because my focus was to bring to the plate, to bring to the discussion here, how do we, engage with the demands that are very often peripheralized, the concerns that are very often in the periphery of the most exploited sections of, the peasantry in India, whose interests, whose dilemma, whose actual crisis is not, reflected in great depth in the Swaminathan report. So that is why, I see that report as imbibing many things, in talking about many things, but definitely its concerns is, gravitating towards how do you increase the return, the return to, cultivators. But of course, here, the key constituency of producers was not, the marginal and poor peasantry. So that's why I, didn't use that register. And I, again, if I've left out a question, Comrade Asit, in responding, you could always just quickly send it to Roger and I'll look at the chat box again. Ian, yes, just Meanwhile, we can perhaps hear from others. I'll just quickly look at Ian's second and third question in the chat box.
Okay, thank you. Right, Finn. Finn is from Dublin, chair of the Dublin Trades Council.
Comrades, I want to begin by thanking Maya for a very interesting contribution, very informative. So I want to ask a question and then add some points of my own, explaining the Irish experience in terms of the small farmers in the country. The question is, how does the struggle that developed around the peasant movement and the small farm movement in India reflect itself in the political controls in the country, the effect or influence on Modi's policies and on Hindu-based political parties and Hindu nationalism? I'm just wondering how it relates to how the struggle has unfolded and affected these developments. In terms of Ireland, it seems quite different. That's why I was interested a lot in what Maya had to say. In Ireland, following independence in 1922, right up to the mid-60s, the overwhelming majority of farmers, and it was a farming country principally in terms of its produce and its working population, the overwhelming majority were small farmers, small proprietors owning land of perhaps 20, 25 acres, and it was subsistence farming. And the farmers, just like Maya explained in India, had to find other sources of income in order to sustain their lifestyle. So they were farmers on the one hand and working in local jobs on the other. The big farmers, on the other hand, always had a base. They were able to sell into the British Empire when Ireland was part of the empire, and they sustained that measure of control following independence, and they still are very influential. The larger farmers, you'd see them in the country, you can see the big estates that they're still, the large farmers still control. But when Ireland joined the European Economic Community, as it was then, in 1973, the situation changed. The Common Agricultural Policy, as it was called, guaranteed prices for certain produce that farmers produced. So irrespective of the cost or the labour or the market values of the commodities, the European Union Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP as it became known, guaranteed an income to the smaller farmers. And that stabilised the situation because the European market would then take that produce and sell it across Europe at common prices. So that affected the situation in terms of politics. There was never a really strong political cooperative movement. There were cooperatives between smaller farmers. There were creameries and produce produced that were then sold principally through the creameries in the market. And in fact, one of the big international companies now that is run from Ireland is called Kerrygold, and they sell butter and cheese and these things all over the world, very big in America. That emerged originally from a co-op of small farmers. So the experience is in many ways different. I'm interested to hear some of the comparisons. In the 19th century, the situation was quite different. There was then a peasant class who had no rights to the land. They could be evicted at will by the large landowners, and it was very like it would have existed in the past in all the land that imperialist powers controlled. But Marx had he wrote a few particular articles in relation to the struggle in Ireland. He said that the British landlord class was relying, and Marx had put a lot of emphasis on the developing revolution in Britain. He said the British landlord class was relying on Ireland for many of the advantages that they could use to sustain their own rule in Britain, in the UK. One was cheap food. So they were able to import cheap food into Britain, which of course, in terms of the labour theory value, would have kept down the cost of labour for the capitalists. Also, that the existence of the landlord class in Ireland strengthened their position in Britain, and Marx argued that the independence movement in Ireland, or an independent Ireland, would break that connection, and that you would then have a small farming class separately and not dependent on the British landlord class. And consequently, Irish independence would weaken the landlord movement in Britain. And again, Marx was approaching this as to the effect it would have in Britain. He even argued actually for tariffs, that an independent, no, I'm not saying Marx is comparable to Trump, but he argued that tariffs could be introduced by an independent government, which would then make it more difficult for the British landlord class to dominate in Ireland. And finally, he also said that the political situation in Ireland meant that huge numbers of agricultural labourers and workers had to emigrate to Britain, and as a consequence, lower the wages in Britain because of the exploitation and divisions fomented by the capitalists in Britain, and also create divisions in the British working class between Irish and British workers. So Marx argued in relation to the Irish struggle on the land from the point of view of the effect it would have internationally, and in particular the effect it would have in Britain. Now, today, there is no small farming class in any sense at all that's significant in Ireland. The two major capitalist conservative parties in Ireland, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael as they are known, the Fianna Fáil party traditionally lent on the smaller farmers for its support, and Fine Gael lent on the larger farmers for its support, but that's gone now. Now both these capitalist parties are conservative parties whose main base is amongst the industrial and service working class. Incidentally, Ireland is now a modern industrial economy. It's no longer dependent on agricultural produce, and even though it's a very large part of its export, nonetheless, Ireland is no longer reliant on a peasantry or a small farming class. It's an industrial country, and consequently, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the two conservative parties, have lost all connection and all relationship with the struggles that originally began on the land. Now, I make these points in relation to Ireland not for any particular focus, but just to show the differences and the struggle, but also some of the comparisons and some of the quite interesting links between the way Moya explained the role of the small farmers and peasantry and the developing struggle as it emerged in Ireland. So thanks again, Moya, for your contribution, which I found very informative.
Well, thanks, Finn.
Roger, I thought I'll just quickly respond to both Ian and Finn.
Sure.
So thank you for your comments, and I do concur with what they have flagged in their questions, comments, and responses. I would just say that I'm adding on to what they have identified in their questions and comments. So yes, Ian, the point is, there is no homogeneous, peasantry. There's no homogeneous peasantry, and hence there is no one, format of the peasant movement. And the whole point is that, while in certain parts of the world, I'm not trying to provide a meta narrative for each and every corner of the world. I know there are specificities, but I'm of course, highlighting the fact that in regions of the world, in parts of the world where you still have a peasantry, then what is the revolutionary left's, reading of the situation and its strategy? So yes, in that ways, the revolutionary left will identify the class antagonism, the class distinctions between, the peasantry. And in that ways, therefore, there is no, homogeneous peasantry. And there is, therefore, a very dangerous tendency of agrarian romanticism, and we're seeing it across the world, in different parts of the world. And yes, that's an agrarian romanticism that wants to conceal that class contradiction that exists, and it's being peddled by the right wing. So yes, I'm very, very I don't have time to go into this, but I'm grateful that you brought this point up, and one has observed it as a very prominent tendency. Finn, I would just add on to what you're saying, because I agree with whatever you have highlighted through your set of examples and elucidations. I just say that there is there has been historically speaking, we know an imperialist chain that has existed in, when it comes to food commodities, sugar, coffee, tea, etc., where, of course, certain parts of the advanced Western, capitalist world has actually benefited from that imperialist chain and that flow of food commodities and related agrarian raw material. And I actually see that, in many ways, we've seen in a very pervasive way a certain agrarian romanticism being, manufactured, being sustained in various forms, because it actually serves, this purpose somewhere, the imperialist, purpose of concealing that side of the story, that how the overexploitation of human labor and other resources of one part of the world has actually helped and facilitated the, the industrialization and capitalist development in, other regions of the world. So just to, I don't have time to go into the detail, but just to add on to, what you've already put out there, that would be my immediate response, building on what you have said. There was a comment I could see before we go to Shadman about the CPM. I saw it in the chat box. See, my whole presentation has been about asserting very, very categorically that we need to see the very, very concrete class distinctions, class contradictions that exist within the ranks of the peasantry. There's no homogeneous peasant category. And, it's unfortunate that, rather than the left hegemonizing, the political system, it's the mainstream political system, which is hegemonized, the left, the CPM in this case. And so they have actually, taken positions like this, where they are, conflating what are actually very contradictory class positions within the peasantry and seeing them as a homogeneous bloc. In terms of, if I've understood the latter half of your comment in the chat box, we see a similar conflation in the Maoist, movement, where, their politics around class alliance is also dangerously assuming that, there is there's no, these class contradictions between a rich farmer and a poor marginal peasantry is actually missing and is not recognized. And we see that even in other constellation of left forces such as the Maoists. And I do not agree. I do not agree with that assessment, because I think what's happening on the ground shows us that, we have to see those contradictions in their real form, how they're playing themselves out, and where the seeds of actual transformation lie. They lie with, the demands that can be escalated, that can be built on of the most, vulnerable sections of the peasantry, that's landless agrarian labor, marginal peasants, and restructuring the movement according to those demands, of those distinct demands, and building an autonomous movement of poor peasants and agrarian labor.
Okay, thanks, Maya. Shadman, yes, welcome.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Comrade Maya, for such an insightful talk. I basically wanted to ask, like, when we talk about the most exploited section of the peasantry, how do we see this discourse on caste-based inequality in land ownership and surplus appropriation, and especially how it is being addressed within the peasant movement? So, I mean, in short, like, how do you think, like, how important is it, or how prevalent do you think this discourse is in shaping the current peasant mobilizations, especially within the left?
Right. Any other comrades have any questions or points? They can be small or large, no problem. But please don't feel shy to come in. If not, then Maya, would you like to just briefly reply?
Yeah, so thank you for your question, Shadman. The point is that if we look at, for example, the ranks of poor peasantry in India, or neighboring countries in India that again have a peasantry which is not homogeneous, we'll see that they are coming from the quote unquote lower caste groups. So this itself indicates that those who are entrapped in the cycle of poverty, that's where actually the caste stigma, your low caste status, the caste hierarchy is being reproduced, right? So there's a reproduction of caste and related stigma precisely due to the propertylessness that you are, inheriting, the poverty that you're inheriting, and the fact that the larger, policy framework, the way things, are working, are also ensuring that you remain entrapped. So that whole part of my discussion about, interlocked markets and how the state and, rich farmers and, corporate business houses are very much keeping that interlocking of markets going, because that is what keeps the rural indebtedness, the propertyless going, and that itself reproduces people in their inherited stigmatized, caste statuses that they have, been born in, and they're not able to break out of it. The city allows for those distressed rural migrants who move into cities. The city somewhere provides you a kind of let's say, you can conceal your caste to some extent, but urban life, especially if you're trapped in the informal labor market, even there, we see that there's very little scope for concealing your caste, stigmatized status for very long, because ultimately, if you're earning less, you're also, then have a situation where you have to live in the poorer quarters of the city. And there you see ghettoization, and you see, again, a reproduction through urban poverty of your, lower caste status, your working class position, reassert itself, getting reinforced.
Yep, thank you very much, comrades. Right, any more questions, any more contributions, please? We have comrades from all over India and the Indian subcontinent, as well as from other countries around the world. We'd like to hear your experiences, your contributions to the discussion, even simple questions. Please don't be shy. I think Maya has given such an absolutely comprehensive and exhaustive explanation and analysis of the situation. Perhaps comrades feel they don't have much to add, but or even much to ask. But please, comrades, don't feel shy. Don't hesitate. We have to see these struggles, of course, always from an international point of view. The working class has never been more internationalized, more concentrated, and the world has never been faced such a common experience. And particularly, we're in a new era today where the world is hurtling towards an absolutely catastrophic crisis in terms whether we're talking about the economy, whether we're talking about the threat of war, whether we're talking about the climate catastrophe, whether we're talking about the growth of racism and communalism, which has been, of course, deployed and is being deployed very consciously by the Indian ruling class and the Indian government at the current time. And we have to learn from one another. The Workers' International Network is exactly what its name describes. It's a forum, as far as I know, you could say it's the only forum that exists, modest and small as we are, but where workers can and activists can share their experiences, can ask questions, can draw the conclusions from the struggles that they've been participating in. And so that's why I do appeal to comrades to sign up and to at least get on our mailing list so they know what topics are coming up, and to join in and to enrich our discussions with their own experiences. Comrade Norma from Argentina.
Thanks. Very short, at least. Very interesting, of course, and very rich, all the discussion too. Just a point, and what I can see from Europe, and in particular from France, and in this movement of farmers, of all what has been presented and discussed here, Just to say that the yellow vest, the Gilets jaunes, this very important movement was in part also promoted, initiated, and very actively by farmers or agriculture in France. Nevertheless, and it's a pity for the left in France that do not pay attention so much to all these movements because it's most urban, left is most urban, urban in the big cities said, or in the surrounding of the big cities. And so I think that this presentation is very important to have in touch what is doing in countries as India and in other countries in which this farmer and which is connected to with the problem of nutrition and all, I mean, and all the in Africa, in South America too. So I found this presentation, which I knew in part, but not very, very important, how much developed. And I register, and I will make diffusion in our network militant in France, which is very sympathetic of course, of all this farmer movement, but it's not the case of left or extreme left and the different in France, as I have said. So thank you so much, Maya, and thank you to you, I mean, to Roger and all who organized these meetings.
Thank you, Norma. Thanks very much.
Roger, I received a direct message from someone, so I wanted to respond to that, and also just a quick, response to Norma. Norma, thank you for highlighting the fact that France also recently saw huge agitations, and there are these instances across the world. But of course, I would just quickly say here that in the case of France, for example, and you would agree that while we're talking about an agrarian crisis and various manifestations of it across the globe, there are specificities, in each case, and the kind of class, very deep, distinct class division, stratification that we see, in Latin America between the rich farmers and poor farmers in South Asia, in parts of Africa. It's not the same, I believe, in France. I mean, you don't see that kind of intensity. So of course, each of these movements that are erupting in the agrarian sector have to be analyzed by the left, especially I'd say, the revolutionary left is to look at them and provide an analysis, which again, strengthens the forces against, capitalism, against all expropriating, segments. Having said this, the quick response to the direct question that came to me, the point is that I, of course, do not believe that either in 2020, 2021, or even in 2024, the farmers' movement has been a revolutionary movement. If you paid attention to the words I used, I said it's a mass movement. And as a mass movement, it held certain potential. It has certain potential, and it has diverse tendencies and possibilities within it. And, for, of course, the revolutionary, left that is looking at this movement, reflecting on it, thinking about future strategy, it's about which tendency do you, catch on to and look at its unfolding and, enable it to take a more prominent, form. And therefore, I drew that, very important point about minimum support prices. Minimum support prices for a rich farmer means something. for the poor marginal peasantry and the urban and rural poor, it has to be minimum support prices with compulsory government procurement. Because MSP in itself, minimum support prices, do not guarantee, security, a return to marginal peasants, right? Because minimum support prices have been around for a very long time. The government is not procuring most of the crops which have MSPs declared for them. So the point is that, we have to see what facilitates marginal and poor farmers in this country to get a return for the labor that's embodied in the agrarian produce, and what also enables the urban poor, the urban laboring poor, food guarantee. And that will not come necessarily just from minimum support prices, because that, if it doesn't come with a government procurement of all major food crops and consumables, then it's basically just a way in which a section of the peasantry is able to keep a price fixed, for the open market, and a price fixed below which they're not willing to go. So my only thing is that food security of the larger urban and rural poor, and giving small peasant producers their due share has to come by looking at the demands from their distinct class position and pushing for an articulation of the movement as an autonomous movement, autonomous from the big farmer, rich farmer lobby. So that's why I pressed for, we need to build the autonomous, independent, poor peasantry and agrarian labor movement.
Yep, thank you, Maya. Finn, if you don't mind, I'd like to make a very quick point before I call you back in.
Take as long as you like, Roger.
Well, I only wanted to say, taking up the last point that Maya made, she's quite right that it would be sort of romantic, the romantic delusion, if you like, to say that this was a revolutionary struggle, or even very explicitly a political struggle. But how easily could it have been if you had any kind of political leadership, if the various fragments that exist now of what was once a mighty communist movement, which split into two, but then split into further fragments, if only any of those had presented some kind of revolutionary inspiration and lead, if only they had been able to sink some kind of roots within the most conscious strata of the working class, how very, very different the situation could have been. Now, we had a situation, as Maya has said, where we had lakhs, that's hundreds of thousands of mainly poor farmers who were demonstrating. It wasn't just a one-off demonstration. It was months and months on end that they were encamped and besieged, literally besieged, the administrative centre of India. They besieged the capital city. They set up temporary dwellings, but they're quite long-term temporary shacks and tents and shanty towns and so on. And they blocked access, and they paralysed the administration, and that was for months and months on end. And then they returned maybe on a smaller scale later. At the same time, you had solidarity strikes, explicitly in solidarity, by 25 crore, that's 250 million workers, not once but several times on 2-day strikes. Now, you might say, all right, these are token strikes. They were, by the way, called by all of the trade union federations, all affiliated to all the parties, except, of course, the ruling BJP, the consciously or explicitly Hindu communal party. But not really genuine trade unions in that federation in any case. But it extended to the whole length and breadth of India. It extended to backwaters, as well as to the main industrial centres. It involved not just transport workers, industrial workers, it also involved street vendors, beanie rollers, farmers, and in almost landless, unemployed populations too joined in one way or another. It was a most incredible mass movement, and it came again and again. Now you might say, yes, these were token strikes. They were just there, and it's true that the leaders of the workers' parties, the different fragments of the Communist Party, and the leaders of the unions, they were letting off steam. That's true. But what a token of the fact, look how much steam was building up under the surface, where they felt obliged to let off that steam, and where once that pressure had been released, the huge reverberations it had. And that's why what we're discussing on the Workers' International Network is, of course, comparing experiences, learning from one another's lessons, from the lessons of the experiences of the struggles that comrades have had around the world, but at the same time to develop a strategy, to develop a sharp, clear political weapon in order not just that these struggles should just erupt and then dissipate, but that they should lead to the goal of actually mobilizing the huge reserves that the working class are. The working class, by the way, today is now a majority of the world population. That was never been the case until the recent period, and it involves women at the forefront of the struggle too, which was never the case in earlier epochs. And it shows the potential, objectively, for a transformation of the whole world economy and world society is there. But what is needed is a political sharp edge, a political clarity, and that's why that is the purpose of organising this kind of meeting and these kind of discussions. So I just think we have to pay tribute. By the way, I mean I know something about the class struggle in India, and I must say I feel absolutely in awe of the courage and dedication that is shown, not just by leading organisers and so on, but by every worker on every picket line. I've spoken to Comrade Asit will know how in Kanpur and in the region, this is some decades ago, but nevertheless, how workers who were demonstrating were gunned down in their hundreds in the Swadeshi cotton mills strike in the late 70s. That was one where they hadn't been paid for several months, and they were living on credit from the shopkeepers, so the shopkeepers couldn't afford to give them credit anymore. They were literally in starvation conditions, and they organised a garau. That's a siege of the management offices, and the bosses, cowering in their offices, not knowing what to do, called up the I think it's called the Civil Guard, the Central Reserve Police, some different elements of the military military police complex of India, and they were guns down in their hundreds, to the extent that the local river Ganga, the Ganges, was actually clogged up with the dead bodies. And that was not the only example. And I mean, if I had more time, I could give more examples, and Asit could, and other comrades I know could do the same. But you see, we here talk about all the sacrifices we make as revolutionary activists and so on, but that's nothing to what every one of an Indian worker on a picket line who takes their lives and their livelihoods and their families on the line, struggling for their elementary needs in this way. And that's a huge reserve of revolutionary potential, which needs to be tapped and needs to be channeled by a clear revolutionary leadership. And that's what the purpose of these discussions is. Unlike other groups, we don't claim that we have the answers or that we are the leadership and so on, but we learn from one another. We learn from the experiences of workers in struggle. And really, the Indian workers have a huge lessons to teach all of us, and we have to engage in dialogue with comrades in India, in Argentina, in France, in Europe, around the world, and that's the purpose of that's the goal of all of us in discussing these, and it's an inspiration to all of us to hear the experiences of comrades in all these different scenarios and all these different countries, and to learn from one another. Yeah, Comrade Finn.
Yeah, Conrad, just a brief point in relation to what Moya was talking about in relation to government procurement and minimum pricing. Because as you've explained, minimum pricing doesn't have much relevance if you can't sell the produce. And the comparison with the European Union is significant. It was then called the European Economic Community. But the European Economic Community bought all of the produce from the farmers, big and small. In there were three areas: cereal, dairy, and some meats. So irrespective of how much the farmer produced, it was bought by the European Economic Community. And then it was often stored in warehousing and on boats and stuff around, but the stuff was bought. So as a consequence, there was huge support in Ireland for joining the European Economic Community because the majority of workers then were in the agricultural sector and transformed the economy. It raised living standards to a significant degree, and that's one of the reasons why there's such support and has been traditionally in Ireland for the European Union, because of historically solving the problems faced by small farmers. That's changed now, of course, as I explained. But the trade-off was an industry, because Ireland lost a lot of its manufacturing base at that time because the European Union wasn't based on a fraternal organization of states. It was to expand the larger countries, Germany, France, Italy, and the industrial sphere. So as a consequence, Ireland lost huge sections of its manufacturing base at that time. For instance, car assembly was one, but there were others in food production and stuff like that. And instead, the Irish government turned towards foreign direct investment, principally from America, but also Germany, Britain, and other countries, then invested in Ireland. So that's why the Irish economy today is very much dependent on foreign direct investment. But the link between government procurement and minimum pricing is very, very meaningful, because if you can't sell your produce, there's no good having a guaranteed price. So I hope the points I've made there contribute to the discussion as it's emerging, because that's how the it was called the Common Agricultural Policy, but that's how the European Economic Community got such support in countries like Ireland, because it guaranteed to small farmers and big farmers alike pricing for their products. And when they did come together in co-ops in the form of creamage, which was largely based around dairy produce, they had to sell that stuff in the market, and the guaranteed pricing resolved their problem as far as the small farmers were concerned. But that class is gone now, and Ireland is is run by two conservative parties in a coalition, whereas at a past time, each of these conservative parties, who are now more or less a single party, relied on the small farmer or the bigger farmer for support, but that division is now gone. So I hope that contribution aids or contributes in some way to the discussion that's happening about government procurement and minimum pricing.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Comrade.
Finn. You brought in a very important, dimension here. And I would just quickly say that in the context of India, where, of course, a very distinct poor marginal peasantry exists alongside a very distinct rich farmer. The point is, when I was making this argument about minimum support price and saying that it doesn't amount to any rights or protection for the small marginal peasantry, it's precisely and has to be precisely backed by something like compulsory government procurement, because the rich farmer in India and many parts of South Asia actually is not that interested in selling crops to his produce to the government agencies. They actually want to sell in the open market, and the MSP, minimum support prices, basically help them get better prices in the open market. And in absolute opposite for the small marginal peasant who can't even access the open markets. It's a huge question for them that, they get a price from the government itself, from the state agencies. And hence, precisely because of that, I would say there's a distinction between what rich farmers today, wherever they exist concretely as a class, when they're demanding minimum support price, they actually are not per se interested in, having that, dealing with the state. They actually just want the state to guarantee certain prices so they get a better deal in the open market. And they actually look to the state, the government agency, only in conditions of distress where, there is a crash in the market. So there is some guarantee that the state will step in and give them a certain price. For the marginal peasantry, it's, of course, a very different ballgame, a very different kind of demand where they're coming from and they're demanding something like MSP. So I'm glad you caught on to that point and have reiterated it. I would just say to Comrade Roger, yes, as a mass movement, the peasant movement that erupted in India recently, I do see it, as a ray of hope. It was perceived as a ray of hope. But there have been so many huge mass movements in India, in the pre-colonial context, even in, post-colonial context. But my larger point is that, there's a mountain that goes into labor, and what comes out of it is like mice. That puts us in a situation where we have to see that, yes, there are these, mass movements that have erupted, but, what is the trajectory that is emerging as the prominent trajectory? Where can this go? And, that's where I think we need to locate, the fact that this movement that erupted, it was, erupting and very forcefully it had its, presence amongst the rich farmer lobby. We can't deny that. And particularly in certain states like Punjab and Haryana and parts of UP, because that's where, the mandi system, the government-backed produce markets are still, somewhere functional, right? So we saw that huge mobilization in Delhi's borders from these specific states. In the rest of India, it wasn't as if, that mobilization necessarily broke out on the same demands or was necessarily consistent. So we have to see that, that it didn't become a generalized a mass movement across, peasants in India. There's fleeting moments of some joint action programs, and then, that also dissipated. And secondly, we have to also see that, in many ways, the movement was, one in which, the rich farmers were calling the shots. There were demands, there were efforts to get every village council, every Gram Sabha to pass a resolution against, the 3 controversial farm laws. But we saw those kind of efforts being, fractured, not being allowed to, unfold further, because actually rich farmers, in India are very worried about, these kind of possibilities because they can take a more radical turn. So we have to see the internal, contradictions and the obstacles that's created, and therefore, look at and press for an analysis and engagement that all the more allows us to, see where the actual seeds of transition lie, as I keep saying, and how can we, build that independent, poor peasant, agrarian labor movement, which will also actually find a more organic alliance and response from India's urban working class.
I completely agree with you, Maya. That's really the point I was making, that these huge mass movements again and again and again, which show the potential, which show the dynamism of the movement to revolt, where people are prepared to take their lives in their hands and to make the most absolutely indescribable sacrifices for a cause. And as you say, the mountain labours and produces a mouse. Why? Precisely because the one thing that is missing is some kind of political leadership and political goal beyond the immediate demands of the movement in process. And that's really the point, that it's the complete dereliction of the responsibility of what was a mass communist party, which played a huge role in the past, and then because of completely indefensible compromises and alliances and so on that they made, they deflected, they allowed the movement to be deflected again and again. I'm not talking about just in the kind of recent times. I'm talking right back to the beginning of the struggle, sort of the beginning of the 20th century, and maybe even, well, beginning of the 20th century onwards, when the Communist Party, for instance, during the course of the Second World War, switched overnight from a policy of revolt against British imperialism to a policy of collaboration with British imperialism because of the interests of their paymasters in Moscow. I've got many examples and stories I could tell, but of course we don't want to take time on that. But since then too, how when the Communist Party split, and again the fact that this mighty mass movement split into two parties, the Communist Party of India and the Communist Party of India Marxist, that there too neither side gave any independent inspiration to the working class to take an independent lead of their own, and they simply sought alliances with this or that faction of the ruling class, with the CPI maintaining an alliance for decades with Congress, with some wobbles here and there, and the CPIM for a long time teaming up with the progenitors of the BJP, along with other dissident factions, if you like, of the ruling class. And as a result, again and again and again, possibilities were just wasted, criminally squandered. And we're seeing the same thing now, although the Communist parties, understandably and justly, have lost a lot of the previous momentum that they had in the past. But nevertheless, we're seeing again that there is no mass force which is embedded in the working class and even in the poor peasantry to be able to give a sharp edge political direction to this constant turbulent display of revolt and rebellion. So that's really the task of the day. Right. Any other comrades want to speak?
I would just quickly say here that, given the current nature of the ruling dispensation, led by the Bharatiya Janata Party, and the kind of, totalitarian, authoritarian nature of the state, there is a tendency, that one has seen on the ground where, any kind of oppositional mass movement is, very quickly seen as, very formidable. And again, because the context of today's discussion was the mass peasant movement in recent times, I'd just like to reiterate and end with this, that we have to remember that, for a section of the rural population, that's the rich farmer lobby, they have invested in this movement, they're involved in this movement because for them, this is a conflict with the state, because they're trying to wrest certain further concessions from the Indian state. And this segment of the rural population does not want the struggle to unfold within the village. So this is more like peasantry versus state, and very conveniently, there's a forging of certain kind of given homogeneity to the peasantry. But we know that this precise segment is uncomfortable with, a further unfolding of class war within the village, a village which is actually very, clearly drawn along class lines. And I think that's where we as, left activists need to, consider that how do we facilitate somewhere the debate, the discussion, the efforts are there. How do we further facilitate, that contradiction to open up, to deepen, within India's rural countryside is very crucial. So we move away from the axis of, Indian farmers against state into also the question of, there is no homogeneous, peasantry here, agrarian producer here. And this is also a major fight about, whose rights are we talking about? A fair price for whom? Whose produce, right? So that was where I anchored this discussion. And there's a longer history to the peasant movement in India for which we don't have time, and a longer history of its alliances with the left, with the working, laboring, urban masses, which of course I don't have time for. But I think I have left us with some thoughts which I hope help our discussions, future discussions.
Okay, thanks, Maya. Are there any other comrades who want to speak? Any questions, any points? If not, Maya, is there any final summing up you want to make?
No comment, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think it's been an absolutely fantastic meeting. We've all learned a lot. I certainly have. And thank you very, very much to Maya, and thank you to all the comrades, particularly the many comrades here from India, for your contributions. And as I said earlier, you're very, very welcome to come to future meetings of ours. We meet every week. However, I should say, having said that, next week we have a particular reason for not meeting, because it's the May Day weekend. And on that Sunday, 4th of May, there will be mass demonstrations, or at least workers' demonstrations, or in every country, or many countries, probably all the countries that are represented here. And we don't want to. It would be futile to try to organise a kind of closed-door discussion meeting at a time of these demonstrations around the world on the streets. The following week, we'll be meeting to discuss the meaning of May Day. May Day has a long history, stretching back, what we'd say, nearly 150 years, or not far short of that. And it's recognised as the Workers' Day of solidarity and of aspirations for a new society. So Comrade Finn will be leading off on that, giving a history of May Day, what May Day means, and what the message of May Day is for us today. So I hope to see comrades there in 2 weeks' time. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your contributions, and I hope to see you all again. Thanks, comrades.